Look, thanks. I'm actually not going to say anything about investment management. There's a panel later today, I might say a little bit then. ACON is the AIDS Council of New South Wales. We were founded at the height of the epidemic in the 1980s, and so the primary mission is to end HIV transmission and care and support people with HIV. A little bit like Kentucky Fried Chicken became KFC at some point because it wasn't all about chicken. We moved from the AIDS Council of New South Wales to ACON because we do HIV, but also more broadly LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans health, smoking, alcohol and other drugs, mental health, young people, workplace inclusion and so on. So that's where I fit on. Can I also acknowledge that we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. The people of the Aboriginal people of Australia have looked after this land sustainably, ecologically, responsibly for, as Cheryl said, thousands and thousands of years, and Lord, do we need that now. And I also acknowledge my own community elders, the LGBTQ elders who marched on the streets and risked their freedom all those years ago. In a couple of weeks, is the 42nd anniversary of the first Mardi Gras, so that people like me could enjoy my freedom today. A few months ago, I was researching my family history, and I came across a letter addressed to my grandfather. It was from his employer, the Reichskritikergesellschaft, which was one of the big German state-owned banks. The date of the letter was the 29th of July, 1933. Adolf Hitler was in power, and it informed my grandfather that thanks to the recently passed law for the reformation of the professional civil service, unfortunately they have to terminate his employment. My grandfather was terminated for no reason other than the fact that he was Jewish. So I'm standing here as the chair of the largest LGBT organisation in Australia. It's a great privilege. I hear that somehow there's this war between LGBT people on the one hand and people of religious backgrounds on the other. We heard from Emma earlier today that we shouldn't make the assumption that people from religious backgrounds don't support LGBT rights. Well, we also shouldn't make the assumption that LGBT people don't support the rights of people to practice their religion. Of course we do. The reality is far more complex than the binary that's portrayed. But nevertheless, we have been in some kind of a rancorous debate over the past few years, and this religious freedoms discussion, it's about many things, but at least in part, it's about this conflict between the rights of LGBT people. You'd think I'd know how to say that acronym. and religious freedom. So let me tell you very briefly what it's been like personally and for my community to be, as you know, the centre of attention in a public campaign, in a public debate, culminating in a public vote about whether same-sex couples should have the right to marry. Now a discussion about religious freedoms, not always civil, though sometimes. The honest answer for me personally is it really wasn't too bad. But I think part of the reason it really wasn't too bad, I mean, it was unpleasant, but I had consciously put myself and my organisation somewhere near the centre of the storm, and it actually felt empowering to have a role in the debate and what ensued. I think if the outcome of the vote had been different, I might have a different answer, and moreover, I'm not really sure that I'm the person you want to be asking that question. 16-year-old me would have had a very different answer, and so too the young transgender person in rural New South Wales or Western Australia who isn't able to tell anyone about their identity, and so too the homeless LGBT person on the street of Sydney. Up to 40% of LGBT homeless people young people on the streets are in fact LGBT. And if the measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable, I think we actually didn't do our best. Let me be polite. I think there were other ways to achieve the reform that we did in fact achieve. I spoke in the last couple of weeks to Joe Ball, who runs Switchboard Victoria, which is the national, so it's the Victorian branch of the National LGBT Counselling Service. I asked her what it was like for her service during this marriage equality debate. She said, well, first of all, the rate at which people were calling in distress was up 40%, and it hasn't dropped since that time. It's stayed constant. Secondly, the alert level of the calls was much higher. There were far more calls around suicide and suicidal ideation than before. And thirdly, we know of several cases of actual suicides, which we believe we can directly attribute to the stress of the debate. So the truth is it hasn't been easy, and we're now in a debate about religious freedoms, and others have covered that very eloquently below. If it's not clear from my introduction, of course I support the rights of people of any religion and no religion to practice that religion freely, but I don't support the right of the right of people to use religion as a sword to harm other people. A wise person once said, you should be able to swing your arm freely until the point it connects with someone else's chin. And I think that's the situation we're in, where the proposed laws go further than they need to. So I agree very much with what Tim Costello said earlier. Despite all of this, I'm actually pretty hopeful. And I'm hopeful for a couple of reasons. The first is, though the debates we've been in for the past couple of years haven't been that pleasant for my community, if you take a step back and look a generation back to those people who marched in the first Mardi Gras, a generation ago, people like me were put in jail because of who they loved, and today I can marry the person I want because of who I love. So generationally, we've made tremendous progress. I'm also hopeful because I've seen religious communities and LGBT communities work constructively together. Actually about 18 months ago now, the Great Synagogue of Sydney, just some background, the Great Synagogue of Sydney the congregation was founded in 1839. There isn't the same kind of hierarchy there are in some churches, but it's commonly considered the mother congregation of Australian Jewry. When the Pope comes to Australia, that's where he visits. Governors General, you get the picture. Held a dinner for LGBT people. Now, 5 or 10 years ago, that would have been inconceivable. And those of us who attended know very well what conservative Jewish law says about same-sex relations and same-sex marriage. We know that we're not going to be able to marry in that synagogue now or in the foreseeable future. And yet we were welcomed. The senior rabbi gave a speech on it's called the Bima, the podium, about including people of all backgrounds, including LGBT people. And I don't think a single LGBT person left that night feeling like they hadn't been heard, and I don't think a single conservative religious person left feeling like anyone had tried to impose on their rights. And if those conversations happened in every synagogue and church and mosque and temple in the country, the war would be over. And if you say to me that's impossible, well, I would have said it's impossible that we would have this conversation in a synagogue 5 or 10 years ago. So I'm hopeful. I also know that these kinds of collaborations between partners you really wouldn't expect to partner have happened at a national level in this country. When HIV came to Australia in the 1980s, it was affecting gay men, sex workers, injecting drug users, the most marginalised people in the communities, and they weren't charged. What happened? The federal health minister, his coalition shadow counterpart, got together with these communities and the doctors and said, how are we going to sort this out? Ida Buttrose, who was the editor of New Idea and some other magazines, was the chair of the National AIDS Council, on the phone to Bob Hawke, the Prime Minister, how are we going to sort this out? Fast forward 35 years, Australia has the world-leading HIV response, and we're effectively on track to end HIV transmission, and just about no one in the world can say that. So the decisions we make today are going to affect what happens in 30 years' time, and we need to think very carefully about how we do it. I'm going to close. I see I have 2 minutes left. Just touching on something John said this morning, and I want to go back to my grandfather's story and tell you what happened next. My grandfather had to flee Germany to South Africa as a refugee. He didn't know my grandmother, but she fled as a 15-year-old. She landed in Namibia, eventually found her way to South Africa. They married, had my mum and a sister. My mum became a social worker in the townships during apartheid. And I was born in Cape Town on the coast. And when you look out from the coast, you can see Robben Island, which is where Nelson Mandela was in prison for much of his 27 years. And when I was born, he was there in the prison. So I want to end with Mandela. And this is coming back to what you said earlier, John. In Africa, particularly Mandela, but actually all over Africa, they talk about Ubuntu. Ubuntu means interdependence. So I'm here talking about LGBT rights, but it's not separate from the desire for homeless people, people with a disability, for Indigenous Australians, to have equal access to achieving their fullest potential. So we're all in this together. I'm absolutely thrilled that there are so many people in this community who are interested in having these discussions, and I can't wait for them to continue.